is it's in the pain, it's in the suffering where we can see the amazing beauty of the human being, to become more than that, to overcome it, right? To transform it, to turn that depression or that dark night of the soul into, a beautiful creation. Because here, like, we're educating people to not realize how powerful they are.
Poetry makes accessible to us not only what we have, but also all that we have not experienced or become in ourselves. It reveals to us what we are, enables us to know our real selves.
It's only the sick souls, the people who feel they wish that they felt comfortable in the world. They wish that they fit into the culture as it is now, because it's easier if we did. But for those of us who just can't do it, then the Platonic tradition can speak to them.
What if your world could be more evocative and mysterious than you could have ever imagined? What if shadows teach us of reality, of beauty, truth, the soul? What if our words can only ever roughly gesture at something so vast and utterly surreal that nothing but the infinite will do? Welcome to the latter, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism, where philosophy meets the soul and the sacred arts are born again. Our hosts for this journey are Dr. Danielle Layne, philosopher and historian, Dr. Greg Shaw, professor of religious studies and philosophy, and Dr. Gareth Polmeer, artist and writer. In this exciting project, we will walk the path of Plato, Diotima, Iamblichus, and others, descending into myth and rising with a bit of mad reason as we open ourselves up to the lived nature of philosophy. So whether you are a lover of wisdom, a student of the mysteries, or just kind of curious, this is the place for you. Light your inner lamp, take a deep breath, and step onto the first rung of the ladder.
So our first episode is devoted to just explaining what we're doing and why. And so my first question is it fair to call Plato a mystic? And what is a mystic? And yeah, can we even put our fingers on the terms that we'll be using in this show?
Okay, can I jump into that one?
Mhm.
Danny, sure, it's fair to call Plato a mystic. The term mystic has taken on a lot of different meanings over the years, and it's associated with different sorts of lifestyles. But what it essentially points to, I think, is that there's some sort of initiation process that's going to happen if one reads Plato, and what Plato himself went through was some sort of an initiation process that he shares in his dialogues. So reading Plato is, I would say, a kind of a mystical initiatory process. And so I think it's fair to call Plato a mystic. In fact, the Platonists after him thought he was somebody who led us into the mysteries, and that's how they understood him. So yeah, it's fair. Definitely, I think it's fair.
Yeah, and I think, as you point out there, Greg, if we look just etymologically at the word, mystikos and the mystical and mythos and myth and these kinds of words, they imply, as you say, this sense of an initiation, some sort of self-transformation, some kind of self-development in some way. And in a sense, the image of the ladder is quite fitting as a general understanding of that, because this sense of climbing or ascending, and of course this is an image, not only a biblical image in terms of Jacob's ladder, but one that you find frequently in Christian Platonic writings as a symbol of ascent. For instance, St. Simeon, the new theologian, talks about an ascent to God as having climbed every step of the ladder. So there's this sense of a development, a kind of movement towards a higher place, if you like.
Yeah. Did you guys both experience like when was the first time you experienced Plato as initiatory or mystical? Was it the first time, the second time, the thousandth time? Does it always come across as mystical? Like, walk me through like when you started to have that kind of relationship with the dialogues.
Well, I'd like to just add one thing to this notion of even the ladder and initiation. Plato self-consciously compared his philosophy to an initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries. And the Eleusinian mysteries required the first step is a catharsis, and it is a descent into the underworld. So if you want to go up the ladder, you first of all have to go down, and you lose something. In terms of my own opening up to Plato as a mystical teacher, it was really through the writings of Thomas Taylor and how he translated people like Proclus and others to Plato. I wasn't reading Plato straight up that made me think he was a mystic. It was by means of the Neoplatonists that I realized that Plato was actually providing an initiation. So
Yeah, I know it's funny because that's exactly how it was for me too, right? Like I remember even describing when I was 19, because I was obsessed with reading Plato. And one of my professors said, "Oh, well, you know Plato well." And I said, "Well, it's baby philosophy." So I thought I was just in like the beginnings of philosophy, that Plato was for, beginners. But it wasn't until I started reading Proclus that I started to see that there was more buried within the text, that it wasn't just baby philosophy or initiatory in the sense of a mere propedeutic to the rest of the philosophical tradition, but there was something about Plato himself that was inspiring the whole movement within the tradition, kind of like the breadth. So something deeper than, the whole, what is that quote, that everything is a footnote to Plato, like that
yeah,
gives it
yeah.
that sense that
Whitehead says it, all Western philosophy is just footnotes to Plato.
and I
Right.
just hate that quote because it doesn't give Plato the due credit for lighting fire rather than just being, because when we think about footnotes, it's just this kind of, oh yeah, by the way, I'm referencing Plato, as if it's a paper being written versus no, like there's a fire that's woken, once you get into the tradition, once you see this kind of torch being passed from one author and one artist and one poet to the next, where you're talking about the images of the ladder, where you see that repeated over and over and over again. And I mean, we can think about Diotima as well and the ladder of love, and thinking of that. I mean, technically she doesn't say ladder but rungs of love. But longer the short of it is that that image has invoked so many different thoughts and feelings from people, that they keep painting or writing because of such imagery. And then, is it Plato, or was he inspired by something bigger than himself? And so, yeah, just putting that out there.
Yeah, I'd like to answer your earlier question as well, and use that as a way to open up a certain idea here about a tradition, or a golden thread, if you want to call it that, or some kind of persistence of what we might call a Platonic tradition, or whatever that might be, and a kind of Platonic mysticism. Greg mentioned Thomas Taylor, translator of many ancient writings, and Taylor was a figure whose translations opened a world of Platonic ideas, like those of Plotinus and Plato himself, to major romantic figures, people like Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and also to William Blake. So my first impression or understanding of Plato as a mystic, and of the Platonic tradition broadly conceived being a mystical tradition, was not by reading Plato, it was by reading Blake. And it was through my, discovery, I suppose, of the kind of sublime beauty and transformative possibility of the poetic. Um, and a certain understanding that philosophy was not only a kind of discursive practice, but one that embodied a whole realm of the imagination as well. And then in my readings of Plato, I was stunned in a sense, and perhaps this is something we'll talk about in different ways, but with the incredible imagery and the incredible drama uh, in things like the settings of the dialogues, in things like the imagery of the dialogues, the charioteer and the Phaedrus, and so forth. So I think one is dealing here with a way of being, a way of thinking, a way of acting, which encompasses a whole different dimension of being to what we perhaps understand in a modern sense as philosophy, um, purely conceived as a kind of analytic or discursive activity. And this, I think, has something to do with the mystical and the initiatory.
Yeah, so
But
let's get
mm,
back to that. Like, so how do you guys define philosophy, mysticism, and yeah, like, so most people would think philosophy is the analytic use of reason, you know, and that what Plato is doing is initiating us into the life of sober reasoning. So here, like, insofar as we're calling him a mystic, are we being heretics to the philosophical tradition, or are we deepening the philosophical tradition? Yeah, what do we think?
I have a lot of kind of opinions about this, and I think that the problem that we have in our world is that we tend to think of philosophy as just the exercise of analytical reason and parsing through arguments, like being an expert crossword puzzle person. And the sharper your analytical mind is, the better philosopher you are. That's not at all what philosophy was for the people in the Platonic tradition, in my opinion. And in fact, they even say so explicitly. Damascus says, you know, I've met a lot of people who are really, really sharp, but they're very shallow in matters of the soul. And he wants something deeper. And what's deeper is what can't be said, what can't be analyzed. But the purpose of the analysis is to free up your mind to let go of certain kind of mistaken ways of interpreting the world. So that the purpose of the rationality and the discursive is to strip us, not to give us something, not to lead us to, it doesn't take us up the ladder. It might allow us to be more receptive to what comes in. Um, but the problem we have is that, one, we tend to think of philosophy as a discursive analytic practice, primarily and almost exclusively. And two, in our culture today, we're materialists. We don't believe that there's anything beyond what can be measured out in the world. In fact, the world is basically not animated by a world soul because there is no world soul. People can't accept that idea. It's a fairy tale. And unless we're willing to let go of our habit of materialistic sort of interpretation, we can't begin to understand the world that Plato and the Platonists were living in, because they weren't reductive materialists, as almost all of us are. And it's harder to overcome that than I think that we might realize. So that's my
Yeah, I think
view of it. Yeah.
I think I agree with you there, Greg. And I think one thing we can attempt to understand when we read these texts that are, after all, you know, over 2 millennia uh, old, uh, is that we've experienced something like a change of consciousness insofar as our capacity to analyze, to stand apart from the world, to revolutionize matter through the scientific method and so on, which of course has brought us incomparable benefits in all kinds of ways, but in other senses even has impoverished us, I suppose. And we can see when we attend to these texts and these ways of being that you allude to, that the whole conception of the participatory relationship between the body, the soul, what we would call, objective reality, is entirely different in a sense. And the distinctions perhaps that we would assume to be ordinary between, me in here and that world out there, uh, are nowhere near as distinct or divided. So I think part of the understanding of what it means to see this tradition as a mystical one is to see that that implies a different conception of the relationship between, let's say, an inner and an outer world, that in fact they are part of the same world, they're not distinct. They interrelate, they interpenetrate, they have some kind of active, participatory connection. Um, and of course, that implies a different conception of what we mean when we talk about uh, forces or energy or matter or any number of things. So, this also opens up the other dimensions of thought to which much modern philosophy has excluded us, which is really a kind of treasure trove of wisdom. And of course, Sophia, philosophy, is the love of wisdom. Um, and wisdom is many things, but it's only, I think, in a very small way, uh, the analytic attitude, if you want to call it that. That's part of it, of course, but it's only one part of it. So, yeah, I think we would do well to sort of try to understand historically how our own consciousness, which we imagine, I think, to have somehow progressed to some, height of achievement and brilliance hitherto unseen in the history of humankind, is also a kind of ignorance, because we've forgotten the deep wisdom and truths discovered by much earlier thinkers.
So, that was actually my initiation, was in writing my dissertation, where in which I could see all of these so-called philosophers, not being inspired by the life, right? That they were kind of hypocritical. Like, they're reading Plato, they're reading all of these amazing individuals, but they're not enacting them in what they do, right? They think they know, right? I'm the scholar, I'm the person who has the wisdom and the meat, and you need to come to me, and anything I say is what is the true philosophy. And dogmatism is always, like, no matter what it is, whether it's dogmatism about your own personal conceits or about scholarship, always kind of like rings a false note for me. And so it's one of those things where I became obsessed with Socrates' minutes of ignorance, right? That the contradiction, so to speak, between him saying, I know that I do not know, while at the same time saying, well, the soul is like a winged charioteer, or the beautiful state would be one with 3 different parts. Like, so he had so much wisdom, right? But at the same time, he constantly doubled back and always said, but I know that I do not know. And so for me, that was very healing when I was surrounded by a bunch of people who didn't seem to get the importance of aporia, of admitting ignorance and seeing that it's not something you should be ashamed of, but it's about the very wellspring of how we can transform, right? Like, once you humble yourself, to go back to something that Greg keeps mentioning, right? This catharsis, or this purification, like getting rid of the need to be the one in the room that has all the answers, but still know that you have a kind of uncanny gift to light fire, to inspire people to live in a certain kind of way. I mean, maybe it was Pierre Hadot that really first cemented the fact that philosophy is a way of life for me, again, during my dissertation writing. But he was one of the first scholars that I read that didn't seem to just be spouting analytic knowledge in an orderly fashion for the sake of, teaching in the common sense of the word, but he seemed to be writing in such a way that you could tell that he believed in the life of these pre-Socratic philosophers, and in Plato, and then so on and so forth with Plotinus and the simplicity of vision. And so, yeah, that's there.
And
Yeah.
the structure that we were educated in, have been educated in, as you know, does not reward us for a genuine wisdom. It rewards us for being able to memorize certain analytical positions or certain things that some scholars have said, and being able to engage those arguments with our arguments and show how they were a little bit flawed. And, we play that game.
Mhm.
And as if that's wisdom. And it reminds me of the moment in the Gorgias where Socrates says to Callicles, "You're lucky in having been initiated into the greater mysteries before the lesser.
Mm,
I didn't think it was permitted." And most of our professors have not been initiated into the lesser mysteries, which is going into aporia,
mhm,
not knowing,
mhm.
into that catharsis, where you experience ignorance in a profound and deep way. And it's only by going through that that you can even begin to engage the kind of deeper wisdom that I think can be found in the Platonic writings. And I would want to add that for Socrates, yes, the only thing I know is that I don't know anything. But he does admit he does know one thing, and that has to do with eros.
Mhm.
So unless eros can be felt in the writings or the speech or the communication of any philosopher, it's not Platonic. And I think that you felt it with Pierre Hadot. There's that kind of sweet kind of feeling of connection with something more profound that breathes through his essays. And that's his eros for the divine.
Well,
And I think that's the Platonic dimension.
well, just so you know, you were the second author that I could feel that Platonic eros, that life in theory in the soul. So I just want to put that out there that
I'm
you're
glad you
writing.
did.
Yeah. So.
I'll tell you, I don't know how the problem that we have is that scholarship is getting better, I would have to say. There are a lot of scholars who are really getting better and more opened up to the depth of the tradition. But we're not encouraged to do that by the institutions that we find ourselves in, generally speaking. Nevertheless, you're doing it. I tried to do it. Others have done it and are doing it. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, I'm finding that a lot of people are trying to push back against, academic philosophy and just seeing the tradition as a series of white men writing books that are incomprehensible to the masses. Yeah, and so I do believe that the pulse, so to speak, is starting to be a little bit louder with regards to what we need as a culture, as a people, as folks that demand more than just the convenient and the practical and the efficient. And for me, I know that I get this from Plato because, of course, to be efficient in teaching philosophy, it's not wandering around the agora and practicing the elenkos and coming up with a new myth every day, right? Like, Plato could have easily just written a line by line, step by step, but he wrote in such a way that you have to be confused, right? You think you get it, but then, and I just honestly, I think there is a movement this is coming to change, but then there's also a very deep seated resistance to those changes. Why do you think that is?
Oh, why do I think that there's a deep-seated resistance? Because we're afraid. We're afraid of losing our control. We're afraid of losing, when you think about catharsis, people usually think, oh, well, purify yourself. That means you get rid of your attachments to the body or material things and all that stuff. And we think of catharsis as having to do with stuff, but it's more of a cleansing ourselves of a certain way of thinking. And that's the scariest thing to do, is letting go of the way we've interpreted the world and the way that it's given us a sense of identity and security, and moving into a new direction.
Mm.
And there's bound to be resistance to it because you're pulling the rug out from people who have created an identity based on, I'll put it this way, they're illusions of knowledge rather than the experience of lived wisdom.
So yeah, I
Which,
forgot. Yeah, but
go
that's the
ahead.
point I meant to ask. I'm so sorry. That's what I
Mhm.
wanted to get at, and I was like, what does it mean for? Because I go back to the conference where we were all together. Living Platonism. Like, do we think that this Platonic mysticism is still alive?
Yeah, It is.
Mhm.
It is because of people like you, people like Tim Addy, who has created the Prometheus Trust, and all of us who, maybe against our better judgment, have been infected by the depth of this tradition and just open ourselves up to it. And I'm just thankful that somebody like Charles Stang was able to pull this conference off at Harvard because he's been infected by it too.
Mm.
And it's not something that's really pleasant to be infected by. It causes us a lot of trouble, institutionally, professionally, even personally. I mean, what kind of partner wants to, hang out with somebody who gets lost in, these kind of Platonic puzzles and identity changes and that sort of thing? It's not that easy a life, I don't think.
No, I think about the importance of the Phaedrus with regards to this issue, right? Of this kind of divine madness, right?
Yeah.
Where, you know, you have to combine reason with this enthusiasm, right? This is the passion, this is the love, this is the Sophia that is much like a seductress, like you can't help, you have to chase her. I mean, in the Republic, Socrates describes her as an abandoned bride who's picked up by the bald craftsman who had just been released from prison, so that we get this idea that in different cultures, it's going to be the technicians and the used car salesman who, this speaks to the analyst who, takes philosophy, Sophia, and makes it into something that allows them to sell things or make themselves look bigger than they are, right? So these technicians of Sophia, but the philosopher is one who kind of refuses to grasp her, right? Keeps chasing her nonetheless. And this is a maddening thing. I mean, like, for anybody who's ever been in love, times that by 10, at least in my experience. And that's what it's like because she's that ever elusive, mysterious woman. So,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of threads we're opening here that touch on a number of other important ideas about this tradition and the kind of limitations and changes that Greg has described in our academic experience and the world in a broader sense. And on the one hand, I think this idea of the erotic in the sense of eros, in the sense of a kind of divinely inspired desire. You've alluded to enthusiasmos, a kind of inspiration. Um, but in this also, and the thing you were getting at most of all, I thought, Danny, when you were talking about your reading of Hadot and of Greg's books, is beauty.
mm,
And what we're also dealing with here, I suppose, is the kind of moral dimension and the dimension of virtuousness or goodness, which this tradition also embodies in different ways. And of course, again, in a sort of purely materialist or naturalist conception of the world, there's really no room for morals other than something as being some imaginary structure of human relations which has no relationship to anything outside of those social structures or so forth. Uh, Whereas in the Platonic tradition and in many of the engagements I've had with it, of course, many of our directions of travel are led by this desire towards the good or to the beautiful or to virtue. And of course, we stumble and we maybe we don't know what these things are and we can never really resolve them. And it's part of our um, challenge, as it were, a part of our nature. But there's a sense that we are compelled
yep.
to this discovery in some way. Um, and the beautiful, of course, again, is something which I think in in the modern world in a very broad sense, it's not something we speak of very much, I don't think. Or if we do, it's in a very superficial way.
Can you say
Um,
more about that, Gareth? I mean, what is this sense of something that we don't speak of? What's your sense of,
mm,
how would you kind of share what that feeling is? What is it that we don't speak of?
well, I think first of all, one of the interesting things about that is that where the beautiful is concerned, um, art, music, poetry is the vehicle for the non-conceptual transmission of those ideas. Uh, and so, first of all, that's something that's difficult to get comfortable with, isn't it? Is the sense of trusting your intuitions, or the sense that some
Hmm.
feeling you have for some special moment of light breaking through a field, or the way you're moved by a painting, or the inexplicable way a piece of music can bring tears to your eyes. These are moments of a certain kind of anamnesis, a certain
Yes,
kind of
anamnesis, right?
remembering, this sense that you know in that instant that there's some truth to that experience. But how do you articulate that? And I suppose in a world where our sense of worth, of um, identity, is so closely aligned to a very materialist conception of those things and a very commercial sense of those things. Uh, and I mean, an example of that would be the use of a word like iconic, and I mean, if we think about the word icon in the Platonic tradition and the way it's used in the biblical Greek, for instance, to be an icon of God, is to be an image of God, is to be a sort of likeness of the divine. But of
Into
course, that's not how we use a word like iconic today. So I suppose there's two parts to the answer there. One is this sense of, again, nurturing a sense of being able to recognize and articulate those recollections, if you want to call them that.
Hmm.
The other is a sort of cultural thing, I suppose, about how we understand or appreciate beauty. Because after all, this is a bigger question I think we've touched very briefly on, about perhaps the relation of the Platonic tradition to other spiritual cultures, and a sense of a kind of perennial archetypal origin to these ideas in different ways. But we find across the course of history, across diverse cultural and spiritual and geographical organizations of people, this sense that the sacred, the beautiful, uh, is a constant mode of self-understanding, of self-discovery in some way.
So this is a question I have for you guys. Uh, and it's one that I think has been dogging me for the last few months, which is basically the very old problem of the one and the many, plurality and unity. All of these people that we say are part of the Platonic tradition, they're all so various and diverse. The way they explain things, the answers they give. So you mentioned virtue and beauty and the good, and Socrates, would offer definition of sophrosune or temperance in one dialogue, and then refute that particular definition in another dialogue. So he was never even the same with himself with regards to something as simple as what is virtue, right? He himself would answer it differently at different moments and different times. But at the same time, there was a unity, right? I would argue that what virtue is practice in philosophy. What courage is the risk to keep doing philosophy, even when it gets, mad and crazy and starts interpenetrating your life and your loves and all these things, to the point of, as Greg was saying, that it's almost intolerable. And that definition of virtue, what it looks like, right? So for Plotinus, it was contemplative, but for Iamblichus, it seemed, everything rested on theurgy. How can they disagree, right? And still be unified as Platonist. To quote John Dillon, that, you know, Platonism is a broad church, as Earl's always also quoting. Like, how can that be? How can we all be so radically different in our interpretations, but still united as Platonists?
You know, when Gareth was talking, and I really enjoyed how you were talking about those moments of seeing beauty, whether it's in a field or in somebody singing or in a poem, and it can move you to tears. And what struck me is that I think what beauty does, those moments of beauty, it's as if somehow a mirror is shown to us and reveals to us our own beauty. And we're reminded of our deep, deep connection to an infinite presence that we carry, and the pain of not always living in that presence. But the pain is mixed with a sort of deep pleasure of being reminded of it in the moment. And how is it that so many different people can be seen as Platonists? And because we're all, I think, struggling with the idea, and I think Iamblichus makes this pretty explicit, but so does Plotinus. Actually, Plotinus is amazing in that he really gets at this beauty being among us and deeply present with us. And he says things like, only he who has seen this knows what I mean, which he's calling on, you know what we experience. And Platonists are those people who have seen this, and we do know what he means. And what he means is something that really can't be defined in any sort of specific kind of definition, but is experienced, is a feeling. And I think the arts, in a way, get at it more directly than a discursive argument will. But sometimes even discursive arguments, if they're carried enough by an eros, can have that same effect. What we're trying to wrestle with is that, at least according to Iamblichus, among all of the immortal beings in the cosmos, and now I'm speaking mythologically here and not in a materialist logical way, but of all the infinite immortal beings of the gods, human souls are the only immortal beings that have to become mortal to fulfill their destiny as immortal beings. So each one of us is an immortal being wearing a mortal identity. And that's the mystery of what it is to be a human being. That's why we get opened up by seeing these infinite, beautifully infinite moments of beauty, because it reminds us of who we are. And it's a struggle. And everybody's going to be opened up to who we are in different ways and different religions. I tend to sort of universalize this as a theme. I think one of the good things about Neoplatonism, and I would even say theurgy, is that there are universal principles in it that are applicable to almost any religious tradition. And I think you're right, Gareth, that we see it expressed in different religions and in different mystical paths.
What I find, like, one of the most inspiring quotes from Plotinus for me was describing the soul as a kind of dancer around the intellect, right? Like tracing out the circle. And that would always remind me of chora, but with the etymology of chorus, or, choreography, where you see that the dancer moves in such a way as to trace out new spaces, new places, unexpectedly so, right? So I always use the example of leaping. You didn't expect it to happen, but there she is. And then, then she makes herself small, and we cry for her because we could feel the world that she's tracing out with her body. And that's the dancerly virtue, as Michael Griffin might, so to speak, say. And what's interesting is, like, what each Platonist does is they become beautiful in some such way that they inspire another person to see that infinite capacity for the human being to do the impossible, create new spaces, new ideas, new ways of visualizing beauty. Like, so for Plotinus, he was able to cause the visual of a dancer in me versus in front of me with his words, right? Like, so those were his magic weapons, so to speak, words, right? Arguments, so that yes, arguments even as dry. So, I mean, I can't tell you, there's plenty of chapters in the Enneads where I'm like, oh, this is dry and boring. Let's move on to the good stuff. But you know what? Those sections might inspire somebody else more concerned with number than myself, right? And so it's important to have all of these various different tools, because it's not about the medium by which we're communicating beauty or the good or the true or the just. It is about, as Gareth was saying earlier, the participation element, keeping that immortal thread, passed on. And in some such way, we're hoping, because that's another, I think, Platonic virtue, is this hope and faith that our enactment of beauty, dancing it out, writing it down, painting, that it will keep going on. It will be the immortal that we so remember, something like that.
Yeah, I don't quite know how to respond to what you just said, because I don't, and that's okay too. We don't always have to have something on our mind to say, because I kind of tire of that among intellectuals that, as soon as you stop talking, they're immediately talking. So here I am immediately talking about the fact that I don't have anything to talk about.
Well, I was just trying to say that one of the things that I am inspired by, and the reason why I guess I'm, hoping that we continue this process, is the importance of Platonism as something we feel that we have a torch, right? We're like Artemis, right, in the dark, and we've got to find other people in those liminal spheres, because we know, right? So we're thinking about, our culture and people, like in the consumer world, in the world of efficiency, in the world of objective truth, and you're born, you get married, you die, right? Like that's all there is. We're mortal beings condemned to the material plane. And don't you know, Danny, this is all silly and crazy to think that you could possibly have any relationship with the more than human, the beyond the human. And part of what it feels like as a Platonist is we have a duty, but not in the Kantian sense, right? Where it's, some deontological demand, but like, no, a freely loving desire to wake people up to the value of beauty and the good. Yeah.
I completely concur with what you're saying. And I think part of this desire to do that comes from feeling the ache that we share in our culture for something more. We feel it personally, but we can also see it in how empty so much of what people do, the emptiness of what so many people do in order to find meaning in their lives. And most of what we do are just distractions to keep us from feeling the pain of the fact that life sucks and it's empty and we're not happy. And rather than just accepting that and wondering, couldn't there be something more, which is a good starting point. That was my starting point. And it might be my starting point of a lot of people who are eventually drawn to Plato and philosophy. But in terms of people like us who want to communicate the richness of this tradition and the depth of it, I think we need to be tuned in to the suffering that we sense in the culture that we're in and the hunger that people have for meaning that they're not getting from the culture that we have. There's got to be something more than just whoever piles up the most dollars is the most fulfilled. That's basically the story that our culture is presenting to us. And that leaves people feeling bereft in terms of meaning. And we've got to find a way, I don't know how, of being able to talk to what people aren't getting, and helping them to recognize that those feelings of feeling alienated aren't bad. In fact, they're clues to how they could get to a deeper place. But I don't hear a lot of, there's not enough of us talking about the importance of honoring our feeling of depression and alienation as actually a healthy step in the right direction. And I think that it is, but it needs to be explained, or at least it be voiced by people like us.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things I'm always emphasizing to my students is it's in the pain, it's in the suffering where we can see the amazing beauty of the human being to become more than that, to overcome it, right? To transform it, to turn that depression or that dark night of the soul into, a beautiful creation. Because here, like we're educating people to not realize how powerful they are. Like when you say people are suffering from a lack of meaning, well, they're suffering from a lack of meaning because they've been told they can't create it. Like that's the most important thing, right? Is to realize, no, right? We need the kinds of education that remind people of the fact that you can create meaning. You are the source. You can overcome this death of God, or this empty capital. Like you have the power. I know it seems futile. I know it's gonna suck, and I know it's gonna drain you of your energy and cause you to feel alone. But wait, what if you create meaning, whether it be in dancing or drawing or writing a philosophical treatise? Like you are the source, you are the power. And I think that's one of the things that inspires me about the Platonic tradition, is this constant reminder, as we were saying earlier, that you are a powerful being, even if all cards are stacked against you. Like, so I always argue Socrates, was this barefoot, ugly, sometimes rude and crass, but look, we're still talking about him to this day, right? Like that's a human being who did that, right? Who transcended the mere circumstance of living in Athens in the classic age of Greece. I mean, he should be dead and in the grave, but here he is, still present in the things that we do. And that for me is like, wow, look at the human being transcending thousands of years and being fully present to us as we speak now. And so.
Yeah, I was just thinking, just in something you were saying there, Danny, and also something you were saying about a moment ago, Greg, and it sort of comes partly off of this idea of a tradition, and this idea also of this lack, or this kind of sunderance somehow, this sort of fracture. And if you permit me just to read a quote briefly from a figure who, Kathleen Raine, who was a British poet, and she incidentally, she edited a volume on Thomas Taylor, and she was an expert on Blake, and a very accomplished poet of very beautiful poems. And she says, that which mankind truly has in common, and that in him to which poetic symbols address themselves, is not a shared physical environment, but a shared nature, the archetypal world that contains entirely what any one life can only experience partially. Poetry makes accessible to us not only what we have, but also all that we have not experienced or become in ourselves. It reveals to us what we are, enables us to know our real selves. And I think this is what we're getting at in lots of ways here, isn't it? Is this sense that in different dimensions, in different ways, the common bond or thread of a tradition which spans hundreds and thousands of years is this sort of self-understanding or self discovery of the lack in oneself, but that lack, that sort of gap, is a sort of openness of a potential, of a kind of moreness or something like this. But I wanted to ask you, Greg, something here, which, because of I think a few of the points you've made around academic philosophy and what you were saying about culture in a broader sense. I suppose one of the common criticisms or points made about mysticism, or the Platonic philosophy in a sense, let's say, as opposed to the Aristotelian or other sorts of philosophies, is that, well, it's irrational, or it's nonsense. It's just a kind of fantasy. It's fantastical. And I think what we've all been trying to say in different ways here is that that's of course not the case at all. But I just wonder what you thought about that in terms of how this search for meaning that I think so many people seek, um, how would we describe that to people who maybe fear or otherwise are apprehensive about taking that leap into this other space of wisdom that we're describing, when culturally the odds are stacked against them insofar as that's described or understood as a, you know, some kind of irrational or otherwise non-philosophical tradition, let's say.
You know, I was thinking about this when Danny was talking earlier too, is who is this for? You know, how do we communicate to people who uh, hunger for meaning? And sometimes the easy solution is to say, you know, screw it. There is no meaning, and I'm just going to give up on that and just be practical and do practical things. And there are a few people who can do that. I wasn't able to do that. So perhaps it's the case that I think William James talks about the healthy minded and the sick souls. It's only the sick souls, the people who feel what they wish that they felt comfortable in the world. They wish that they fit into the culture as it is now, because it's easier if we did. But for those of us who just can't do it, then the Platonic tradition can speak to them. And we can invite people like that to see the value in something irrational. But I think your approach by using the arts, music, literature, and visual arts as a way of immediately communicating with people and that they know there's something beautiful in it. What is it in them that responds to that beauty? And that's the part that I think that we want to, you know, water and germinate more feelings for, and just start small. But there are some people who are just so miserable in the way the world is right now. Those are the people that we're looking for. Those are, I mean, if we think of ourselves as some kind of weird evangelical cult, it's the losers and the dropouts that we want to focus on, because they're the ones that are most likely to accept the irrational, because they're really willing to give up because they can't stand it. And I know that sounds sort of pessimistic and bizarre, but there's something to that. You have to get people who are sort of sick of the world the way it is, who are willing to get into this. And that may sound like one-sided, and I would need to change the way I say it, but that's how I want to say it right now.
Well, no, for me, like it's always the both and, right? That one of the things that I think students, when they come to philosophy and psychology, like self-help, all of these things, is they want a solution. They want a fix to this, right? They want to get rid of their anxiety or their despair or the sickness, as you're calling it, right? Their aloneness. And like one of the things I always want to emphasize is that like that doesn't need to be fixed, right? Like we've over psychologized human beings, right, to where the only way they can think about their madness or their depression is in clinical terms, and that there's no other way of being in the world, and that we need to fix you. I always make the joke that if Diadema existed today, she would have been prescribed some Prozac and would have been condemned to be a public employee at some sort of state post office or something like this, and would never have been aware, right, as many of us are today, that the magic exists in the pain, and that it's always going to be this weird both and, that we're never going to fix ourselves because we don't actually really need healing. And that's the weird thing, is like, okay, we need healing, but we don't need healing. Well, no, we need to get rid of those old educations, right? Those old ideas that keep us, I guess is the word, hating all of the duplicity or the meaningness of what it means to be human, and cutting off parts that the culture says that we shouldn't have. You shouldn't have that pain. No, you should be a Barbie doll and, bless her heart. But at the end of the day, right, that's what's making people miserable is excising the pain, looking for fixes versus, okay, this is me. I'm the kind of person who can feel other people's pain and experience it within myself. And I just have to take that and make something beautiful out of it, rather than suppress it, make it go away. Because if I like take away that other half, that pain, all of that, and I imagine that at the end of the road, what it means to be a theurgist or a philosopher who is transcended or whatever it is, as perfectly happy and like Yoda, just content, then I don't think then that figure isn't actually showing me the beauty in all things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. When you're talking, oh, sorry, Gareth. Let me just jump in with the bar. You're talking about we're programmed to think we want to solve our problems, become either the Barbie doll or the heroic athlete, or even if we reject that and we go into countercultural sort of kind of dogmatism, because this is kind of a dogma that you're talking about, becoming the Barbie doll, becoming the jock, or you could embrace yoga and become the perfect yogi and don't do anything wrong and get really rigid that way, or the perfect follower of Tibetan Buddhism and do everything right that way. And so the ego wants to feel secure in one way or the other, and usually with some sort of dogmatic narrative to make me feel secure. And I think what Platonism, what you're talking about is, no, accept the flawed part, accept the fact that there's problems, accept those things as the way in which you can be transformed and initiated. And into what? That's what we don't need to define. We don't know what, but it just is, and it's in process, and it's being opened and opened, which I think Socrates represents that kind of mindset. What do I know? Nothing. All I know is that I'm being pulled erotically towards some beauty. That's all that we need to know. And I think you're describing it. But it could be Barbie doll or it could be a yogi. Either way, one's no better than the other.
What were you gonna say, Gareth?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, just one quick response to that, and then something else I'll say connected to what you were saying. But yeah, there's a very beautiful distinction or relationship, largely described in the Orthodox tradition in the Philokalia, the love of beauty, um, of the difference between being in the image and the likeness of God. So in a sense, this idea that archetypally we're all made in the image of God, but through grace and through our own sort of self-development, we undertake this kind of becoming like. So there is this sort of development. But yeah, I wanted to come back to some of the mystics here as well, I suppose, and people who in this very broad tradition have, attempted to kind of arrest the inner struggle and journey of those ideas. And I think what you're saying, Danny, we are, as a culture, as societies, are the kind of pathologization of inner struggle, um, the medicalization aspect. And I mean, I've read it. I've even read it said of Blake, that well, perhaps he was suffering from this or that, and perhaps he was just unwell. Um, but to
I read
read,
a book that argues that Socrates must have been bipolar or something like this because of his like states of just standing still and all of these strange things. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is first off, that's very ableist, but second off, completely not something that we should do with regards to time periods and eras that couldn't even think of this idea of the medicalization of the state of
yeah,
being
but I
human.
mean, I believe Blake when he says, there's that wonderful passage where he sort of, asks himself this sort of, rhetorical question, doesn't he? Where he says, what when you see the sun, do you not just see a round, guinea-shaped kind of glowing disc of light? And he says, oh no, 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 I see a heavenly host of angels crying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. So this sense that, and he says, I um I see through my eyes, not with them, or something like this. There's this sense that there is a truth to his vision. And what I wanted to touch on there in regards to what we're talking about meaning, and also about where the mystical comes into it, is that it's an ability to kind of cultivate or develop a way to go deeper inside oneself as well. Shut your eyes and change your way of looking, says Plotinus. All of us have the ability to do it. Just close your eyes. And that's a precipice, isn't it? To leap from, in a way, this sense of self-examination, of self-discovery, of that kind of inner contemplative journey, which we find so often discussed in different ways. I mean, you think of Dante's journey in the Divine Comedy, the sort of ascent from hell to purgatory to paradise, um, and many other stories like it. And I think, for me, this gets again to some of the truth of myth, in a sense, and the truth and the truth and function of myth in the dialogues, because, again, taking the example of the Phaedrus with the two horses, one sort of pulling up and the other sort of pulling down, and this sort of, the chariot, the soul's steersman, this kind of conflict. um and these are archetypal images, aren't they? They are images that are stories about our inner conflicts and our inner natures, and this is why they're true in many senses. But of course, again, to say something like that, it gets me right into the territory of irrationality
Yeah.
by the modern definition of that sense. That, well, what do you mean that flying horses and, you know circling the heavens on, the Empyrean, and is true? What does that mean? And I suppose so. This is part of what I was getting at with the question to you, Greg. There was, I think that, this many of the things we're talking about here are about sort of discovering or rediscovering how those stories conveyed in so many different ways across that tradition. We find the repeated symbolism of the wings and feathers and flight, for instance. These are because they transmit across the ages this recurrent story of human nature, really, of our sense that perhaps we uh, feel like we've reached the pinnacle of our achievement, or we are at this sort of great moment of history, but then we're thrust back into the, you know uh, challenges of the moment, into pain, into, yeah. Um so we'd also do well to understand why, in that mystical sense, the myths play such a pivotal role.
And the myths, also speak of this, ascent and descent, or you think of Odysseus, that it's not easy, and also doesn't necessarily have a happy ending, right? The importance, as Nietzsche would say, of affirming life in its chaos and its suffering and its confusion. That all of these myths, they're like the kind of myths that we create where everything ends happily, right? That's another kind of myth that leads us down a kind of forgetfulness. That, no, the good myth is one that affirms life as it is. It says this is beautiful even in this back and forth. I mean, some part of me always looks to the Phaedrus and the comparison of the gods that lead, the human being, and the human being as this up and down, right? This back and forth, this erotic thing that is between. And that part of the mission is to realize, oh no, we're a different kind, right? Like, we're not going, like, to become like a god, right? Means, yes, we, like, in our godliness, it'll be otherwise than the God that is absolutely, what they are, versus the kind of God that the human being can become, the kind of God that, as Plotinus would say, is bold enough to descend, right? Audacious enough to say, I can be a god even if I become mortal, even if I let my charioteer, follow the path of the black horse. And that's audacious. That's the madness of what it means to combine reason and unreason, beauty and ugliness. Like what kind
So
of God are you? And so.
what's good about that myth is that it touches at the agony of what people experience in a deep way. That's a myth that's true because it touches who we are in a deep way, in our anxiety and the paradox that we meet. It's not like, oh, do this, do that, and you'll be happy. No, this is a myth that you just described that engages us in our suffering. Um, and I do think, Garrett, you put in a chat reminder of where we are, and maybe I'll put the ball in Danny's hands for that.
Yeah, I wrote it down a few minutes ago. I was like, oh, we got to wrap up now. But I do like the idea of ending on this Platonic idea. So one of the big questions of Platonism, from within the Theaetetus or from the Timaeus, is this becoming like a god, right? That we often want to dismiss, right? If we're just in the world of scholarship, no way Plato wants us to become like a god. Just final thoughts on that before, we close, and then we can discuss what we'll do next week.
Well, if I'm speaking to an academic who says, how can anybody think that Plato really wants us to become like a god? All you need to do is read him and read the Platonists who followed him and knew his material better than we do. That's exactly what they thought it was about. But it requires entering into a different way of imagining what it means to be human than what normally we think of today. But yeah, that's what he meant.
Gareth?
Yeah, I'm reminded of this wonderful phrase by the philosopher Owen Barfield, where he said, words are only themselves by being more than themselves. Perhaps the same thing is true of human beings. And I think in that sense, there's a deep knowledge that Plato touches upon, a knowledge we've spoken about today, that we're already godlike. We already have a divine flame within us, as it were. But our calling, in a sense, is to unforget and to remember. And so, yes, I think that's what he is calling us to do, and what much of his work is about.
And what do you think, Danny?
Oh, I think about Gareth's comment earlier about, pathologization, the kind of emptying of the world of saturated meaning of the more than the surface, and how saying things like that brings up another question in me, which is the courage that it requires to remember these kinds of things and to identify with them. That do we need more courage in 2025 than a Plotinus, an Iamblichus, a Plato? Like, was there a world that you could say and write poetry and prose, and invoke that spirit that may have been a little bit less frightening? And so that's what it, like when we talk about like this, it's to become like a god, and then to know that that is never something you can shake off, no matter how bad your despair is, no matter how lonely you are, that kernel of your divinity remains always in every choice that you make. And yeah, the courage is, that's basically what I tend to get back to. Like, it takes a lot of courage to decide to walk that path. And so
It does take courage. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
But to lack that courage is to lack being really truly human, I think. Sorry to put it so bluntly. Yeah.
Gareth and I were talking earlier, the mantra that I hope my kids have, which is, you can be afraid, but don't be a coward. And so
That's good. That's a good saying. Yeah.
and I think this affirms something that perhaps we can touch on and explore as a whole nother episode, perhaps. But the point you made there, and when we look about us and we see suffering and we see war and we see any other number of terrible things going on, we might say, why search for beauty? Why ask these questions? Why is it worth it? And I'm just reminded of this incredible sermon that C.S. Lewis gave during the Second World War called Learning in Wartime. And he said, human life has always been lived on the edge of a precipice. Human culture has always had to exist under the shadow of something infinitely more important than itself. If men had postponed the search for knowledge and beauty until they were secure, the search would never have begun. We are mistaken when we compare war with normal life. Life has never been normal. So there's this sense that, amidst these things, we, this this question, whether it's in our own lives, in our own inner conflicts, our own sense of asking, why do I want to seek these things? That, well, the moment is now. There's never a right time
Right.
other than now.
That now is always moving and always asking something. We'll have to do an episode on time and the present moment and things like this. But for now, I want to thank both of you for being, my amazing co-hosts as we, trek through this crazy adventure of Platonic mysticism. Thank you guys for listening to the first inaugural episode of The Ladder.